So let's get crazy with context. So we've got our count display here and a counter component here, and then we have our app that renders both of these things. And we want to share state between these two so that we have the count as state and the set count as an updater to that state. And really the easiest way to do this would be to put this in the app, or honestly combine all of these. We don't need 3 components for this, but this is a contrived example just to keep it really simple for you before we get into more realistic examples of using context. So let's just stick with the structure that we've got here and use context to solve this particular problem. So the first thing that we're going to need to do is create context. So I'm going to make my count context with react.create context. And I'm not going to provide a default value. We'll talk about that later. So with that, I now need to make a function that will act as my provider component. So here we're going to make a function count provider. And here this is going to return the count context.provider. And we'll take some props and we'll forward along all these props. So this will just be a wrapper component, which I now can come down to the bottom and wrap all of this stuff with my count provider. And now this count provider can provide the context value that I want it to. So one thing that I should mention here is I could just do count context provider with the value and then so on and so forth right here. But I like to put everything into a component that manages its own state. It can take props, it can do use effect, it can do all sorts of things in there. And so that's why we're going to make this count provider that's going to render the context provider here. Okay, so on top of that, we need to have some value, and the value that we want is a state and a mechanism for updating that state. And so for us, we can just use a simple use state, and I'm going to have a count and a set count. We'll initialize this count to 0, and then I need to provide a value to this provider so that consumers will have access to these values. So I'll just make a value here, and we'll take that value there. And now our count display can get access to this value through context using the use context API. And the reason that works is because we have this count provider inside of our tree. So what context is going to do is it's going to say, hey, you want to get access to some context value. Let me look up in your tree to find the closest provider of that context, and I'll grab the value from that provider. So let's go ahead and get our value from React use context. And we want to pass this count context. So here we've got that count context. We've got our value. And the value is this array. So I'm actually just going to destructure it in place, and I'll get the count from that. Ta-da! And then we'll do something very similar for this one, except in this case, we want the set count value, and we don't need that count value. So we'll just leave that comma right there, skip that item in our destructuring, and we'll save this, and bum-ba-da-dum, it's totally working, no problem. So in review, what we did here was we created a context. We created a function that uses that context provider to provide a value. And then we used the use context hook to consume that value from that count context. And this is all made possible because our provider is being rendered further up in the tree from the consumers, allowing us to have some implicit state shared between this provider and each of these consumers.